There we are. Good. So what we're going to do, I hope, today, over the course of the next couple of sessions, is to complete our discussion of the topic of morality and religion. What I want to do first is take things up from where we were at the end of last time by distinguishing the relationship between morality and religion expressed by the divine command theory, the one that, if the Euthyphro dilemma argument succeeds, we shouldn't believe in, from other possible relationships between morality and religion which are different. So what we can develop then is we can develop a list of such possible relationships. If we go to PowerPoint at this stage, yeah. So look, a first possible relationship is, as we can say, definitional, right? It's the idea that moral concepts are defined in religious terms. And this, of course, is divine command theory. But that's not the only way that morality and religion might be related. A second possible relationship would be, as we can say, motivational. Because it's a familiar idea, right, that sort of the moral role of religion is to give people incentives to do the morally right thing. And there's another familiar possible relationship, an epistemic relationship. The idea here being that religion is a source of moral knowledge. If we can switch back to the other shot for a bit. Let me first bring out more carefully and explicitly the ways in which these possible relationships are independent of one another. They are, with one exception we'll get to, independent of one another in this sense. You can believe in both, you can believe in neither, you can believe in either one without the other. The bit of that to focus on is the you can believe in either one without the other bit. So do that for the first pair, the definitional relationship and the motivational relationship. It's possible to believe in the definitional relationship without the motivational one, right? That would be to accept as, you know, if you bought the argument we encountered yesterday, you shouldn't, but it would be to accept the divine command theory, to accept the idea that what morality is a matter of what God says. But to combine that with the idea that there's no additional need for religion as an incentive force, that people are you might say, naturally good, and so they'll naturally tend to do the morally right thing without the promise of divine rewards or threat of divine punishment. If you had that package of views, right, you'd believe that there was a definitional relationship and not a motivational one. And you can run it the other way around with that pair, right? Perfectly possible to believe that there's a motivational relationship but no definitional one. Right? To do that is to have the view that people are not naturally good, so it is necessary for there to be religious rewards and punishments to get people to do the right thing. But to combine that with the view that what the right thing is not defined or determined by what God says, it's independent. So the definitional and motivational relationships are independent of one another. Similarly, the motivational and epistemic relationships. So you could believe that there's a motivational relationship without an epistemic one. That package of views would involve the thought that it's easy to figure out what the right thing to do is, so there's no need for any religious role there, but that people are not naturally good, so they specifically need these religious rewards and punishments to get them to do what they know to be right. By contrast, you could deny the motivational relationship but accept the epistemic one, right? To do that, what you would do is you'd say, no, I mean, people are naturally good, they don't need religious rewards and punishments to get them to do the right thing, but it's hard to figure out what the right thing to do is, right? And there's a crucial role for religious sources. Without religious sources, people won't be able to determine what morality requires of them. The only place where this independence claim with respect to each of these pairs breaks down some is with respect to the definitional and epistemic relationships. It is perfectly possible, I think, to believe that there's an epistemic relationship without a definitional one, right? It's perfectly possible to believe that morality is not determined by God's will, but it's still very hard to figure out what morality tells you to do, and that, therefore, religious sources are essential to doing that, right? But it doesn't go the other way around. So if you believe in the definitional relationship, I think you are committed to believing in the epistemic one, right? I mean, if you believe that rightness just is constituted by what God wills, then you're surely committed to believing that religion is a source, indeed the key source of moral knowledge. Right? With that final exception, though, I mean, these three are independent possible relationships between morality and religion. So what I want to do now, considerably more briefly than our discussion of divine command theory, is to think just a little bit more about these two other possible relationships. Start with a motivational one. Right? The idea that, as we have it, that religious incentives are necessary to motivate people to act morally. That idea is usefully thought of as combining or depending upon sort of two presuppositions, right? First presupposition that, people aren't naturally good and they need rewards and punishments to get them to act morally. Second presupposition that these rewards and punishments sort of have to be religious ones, because earthly ones, conscience, the approval or disapproval of other people, jails and legal sanctions, all that sort of stuff is not enough to get people to do the right thing. So the two presuppositions would be, that you need, some rewards and punishments, and nothing but the religious ones will do. I don't want to try to say anything terribly definitive about these presuppositions and, you know, this idea that there's a motivational connection right now. All I really want to do is first to tie them into some stuff that we're going to be encountering a little later in the course, and second to kind of contrast two differing attitudes to the possible existence of this motivational relationship. First, the tie-in to later stuff, right? The view of human nature that we've just suggested seems presupposed by the motivational relationship is, or is a close relative of, psychological egoism, the view that everyone's always entirely selfish. And that's a view that we'll encounter in Hobbes and we'll spend a bunch of time thinking about a little later. Second connection to actually, you know, very much that same part of the course. One way of reading what's going on, or part of what's going on in Hobbes' Leviathan, is as sort of sketching a way in which the second presupposition might be false. That is, sketching a kind of political setup of rewards and punishments, incentives, which is sufficient on its own without any additional distinctively religious such rewards and punishments to get people to do the right thing. Right? So if you saw that part of Hobbes that way and thought what Hobbes said was right, that might give you a reason to question this second presupposition. So the other thing I want to do is sort of contrast two attitudes to this motivational relationship. One attitude would involve seeing it positively, right? A person with this attitude would think, well, this motivational relationship gives an important role to religion within morality, right? And that's kind of a good thing for religion, and it's a good thing for morality. And I think that's certainly a view of these matters that you're likely to have encountered, right? There is, however, a sharply contrasting attitude most famously associated with the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose work we'll meet at the very end of the semester. See, Kant's attitude is genuine morality requires not just that people sort of go through the motions of doing the right thing. It involves that they do the right thing for the right reason. It involves doing the right thing because it's right. So as Kant would see it, if what goes on is that people do the right thing only because of, carrots and sticks of whatever kind, right? You haven't then got real morality at all. What you've got instead is a kind of sham, maybe better than nothing, but much less good than, real morality that involves doing the right thing for the right reason. So Kant would have a much less favorable attitude towards the kind of motivational relationship we're here considering. All right, good. So now turn just a little more length to the epistemic relationship, the idea that religion is a source of moral knowledge. Here we can distinguish three different questions. So let's get the questions out there, and then what I'll do is I'll address them in turn. this is, yeah, the epistemic relationship, that's a matter of religion and moral knowledge. But yes, absolutely right. All right, so consider these questions in turn. Begin with the first one. Is it possible for religion to be the only source of moral knowledge? I suggest the answer here is no. Right? At least, if, as we argued you should, you reject the divine command theory, then you reject the idea that moral concepts are defined in religious terms. That is, you take it that morality is, in its fundamental nature, independent of religion. It surely follows from that that it must, at least in principle, be possible to find out about moral stuff without relying on religious sources. So then I take it, given rejection of the divine command theory, the answer to the first of our questions here should be no. Turn now to the second question. Is it possible for religion to be the best source of moral knowledge? I'll probably pop back to the other shot, actually. Yeah. Here, I take it, in an important way, the right answer is yes. So look, this at least is possible. It is possible that you have a number of sort of methods, ways that you might try and figure out the morally right thing to do. Right? That you might, sort of test these against one another as to their success in situations where you face moral perplexity. That some of these methods might be religious and others not, right? I mean, some of them might involve doing the moral reasoning yourself and be non-religious. Others might involve various kinds of appeal to or use of religious resources, right? Appeal to representatives of organized religion, consultation of holy texts, attempts to access direct revelation, whatever, right? And it seems possible that of those methods, right, some explicitly religious method will turn out to be more successful than non-religious methods. Now there is a proviso here, right, that sort of follows on from what we said about the first question. The proviso is, sort of as it were, the ultimate test of success here can't be, the measure of success can't be religious, right? But given that you allow an independent measure, it seems to be perfectly possible that the religious methods for everyday use, right, turn out to be more successful than the non-religious ones. Right? Okay, turn finally then to the third of these questions about religion and moral knowledge. Question, is religion in fact typically a reliable source of moral knowledge? Here, as in another connection a bit earlier, what I want to do isn't really to do anything definitive, but rather to sort of sketch what opposing views here might look like. So one sort of possible view here, right, would be that the answer to that question is yes. Right? A person who took that view would be likely to emphasize, among other things, the ideas that major religious traditions basically agree about fundamental moral rules, that the things about which they agree are largely correct, and on the whole they do a pretty good job of, inculcating these moral rules. And you can see how sort of fleshed out that kind of view would support an affirmative answer to the third of these questions. On the other side, someone who thought religion was not typically a reliable source of moral knowledge would tend to emphasize both disagreements between major religious traditions about moral matters and historical incidents and episodes where it seems that religious traditions have been seriously morally mistaken. So a person taking this view would tend to focus on things like, inquisitions and religion supporting slavery and so on and so forth. Right? I don't aim to really to adjudicate that issue here at all. I mean, that's would be a much more involved thing to attempt to do than I want to get into here. I want only really, as I say, to sort of sketch what opposing views on this issue might look like. All right. The next thing I want to talk about, which you can also think of as sort of the final entry on this list of possible relationships between morality and religion, is natural law theory. Now, there are there's several reasons why it's worth a brief look at natural law theory, as we're going to do and as Rachel's does. There are also reasons to realize that, a brief look is necessarily going to miss a bunch out. Right? So one reason is this, right? Rachel's someplace, I won't find it and quote it to you now, but puts this fairly explicitly, I think. He has in mind the situation of the person who thinks the following. The person thinks, well, I've seen that there's this rather powerful argument, the Euthyphro dilemma argument against divine command theory, but nonetheless, this is the normal form in which the thought comes up. Nonetheless, I think, as a Christian, I'm just bound to believe divine command theory because divine command theory is a, necessary central part of Christian belief. Right? So one reason Rachel wants to take up natural law theory is to show, no, that's not so. Right? He wants to say, look, I mean, on almost anyone's conception, right? The Catholic tradition is a major part of the Christian tradition. Yeah? And divine command theory has never been the official moral view of the Catholic Church. Right? Instead, the Catholic tradition has consistently rejected divine command theory and instead embraced this other view, natural law theory. So, sort of one reason to think about this is it, makes vivid and concrete the point that a commitment to divine command theory is certainly not a necessary or essential part of Christianity. Right? A second reason to think a little about this is, but which also means that you've got to be kind of cautious about it, is natural law theory is, I mean, in some guise or in some form, it's a really long-standing tradition in the history of moral philosophy, right? So the sort of the central natural law theorist, the central Catholic moral philosopher is Aquinas, right? Let me remind myself of the dates here. 1274 is one of them, if I remember, but let me see. It's something like that anyway. It's early Middle Ages, 1200. Oh, there you go, 1225 to 1274. That's Aquinas' dates. Okay. Aquinas is the sort of most important figure in this tradition, right? But moral philosophers are still using sort of the terminology of natural law, 400 and more years later. Right? I mean, Hobbes uses it. We'll see when we get to Hobbes. In the Leviathan, written in 1651, he uses it in a quite distinctive way, right? Probably, well, I mean, necessarily, aware that it's distinctive and that he's sort of pushing it. But, other people use it in ways that's kind of closer to Aquinas' usage, up past the point of Hobbes, right? So, I mean, you've got this huge tradition of moral philosophy that's couched in the vocabulary of natural law. So, I mean, that makes it interesting to look at, but makes it also, dangerous to think that you can cover the whole thing in 20 minutes. Right? So we're not going to aspire to cover the whole thing. We're just going to aspire, sort of, following Rachel's, basically, to give a flavor of natural law theory, in the form in which Aquinas develops it, and to raise some important objections to it, which help explain why it's not a popular view these days among moral philosophers, except those who, work very much in the Catholic tradition. Let's start by trying to give more of a flavor of how natural law theory works, so that the basic outline tenets of the view. Let me see what I've got here. Yeah, okay. So if we can go to the PowerPoint here. As Rachels conceives it, natural law theory has basically three components. You write them down, then we'll say a little more about all of them. All right, so let's say a little more then about these component ideas. So the first idea, the ideas we had that the world's a rational order with values and purposes built into it, that first idea, we've probably switched back to the other view, that's it's an idea that is foreign enough to us that you have to do a little work to see just what it involves. Right? So look, the idea here is that scientific explanation of stuff involves, in a fundamental way, appeals to purpose. Right? That if you're offering scientific explanations, you're going to be consistently appealing to what things are for, what their purpose is. Rachel's talks about this on 54. Let's start 54, first full paragraph, fourth line. Oh, no, third line. Aristotle believed that natural objects have purposes too. One of his examples was that we have teeth so that we can chew. Biological examples are quite persuasive. Each part of our bodies does seem intuitively to have a special purpose. Eyes are for seeing, the heart is for pumping blood, and so on. But Aristotle's claim was not limited to organic beings. According to him, everything has a purpose. To take a different sort of example, he thought that rain falls so that plants can grow. He considered other alternatives, such as that the rain falls of necessity, that this helps the plants only by coincidence, and rejected them. Aristotle, like Plato's most famous pupil, one of the two most famous ancient philosophers, right? He's very interested in scientific explanation. I mean, he's one of the great figures in the history of science, but he had this just very different view about what scientific explanation basically involves than modern scientists do, right? And that view gets adopted and developed by Aquinas, the sort of founding father of natural law theory, right? I mean, the intellectual history there is that much of the work of the ancient Greek philosophers was lost to, as it became Christian Western Europe during the Dark Ages, but preserved in libraries in the Arab world. And then at roughly the time Aquinas was writing, that work once again became available to scholars in the Christian Western European areas, right? And so a standard way of sort of seeing Aquinas's intellectual achievement is, what it involves in a fundamental way, sort of assimilating Aristotle and Christianity, right? But anyway, so the part of what Aquinas gets from Aristotle is this view of scientific explanation, according to which it sort of all involves this appeal to purposes, to what stuff's for, right? Very foreign to us now, right? I mean, one way to see, as Rachel says, right, the scientific revolution is as sort of replacing that approach. But that's what Aquinas thought. So that's the first component. Yeah? Then the second idea is this idea that, as we put it here, this is sort of a paraphrase of some what's in Rachel's, the idea that the laws of nature not only describe how things are, they specify how things ought to be. Right? So the thought here is that you've got these things that are these sort of laws of nature, these specifications of purpose, right? And they play this scientific role. But they don't only play a scientific role, they play a sort of moral or evaluative role as well, right? Rachel talks about this starting at the very bottom of 54. Following the number 2 there, he says, a corollary of this way of thinking is that the laws of nature describe not only how things are, but also how things ought to be. The world is in harmony when things serve their natural purposes. When they do not, or cannot, things have gone wrong. Eyes that cannot see are defective, and drought is a natural evil. The badness of both is explained by reference to natural law. But there are also implications for human conduct. Moral rules are now viewed as deriving from the laws of nature. Some ways of behaving are said to be natural, while others are unnatural, and unnatural acts are said to be morally wrong. Consider, for example, the duty of beneficence. Why are we morally required to care about our neighbours? We are morally required to care about our neighbours. Why? According to the theory of natural law, beneficence is natural for us, given the kind of creatures we are. All right, so you've got these laws of nature, and then they have this sort of dual role, right? They have this scientific explanatory role, but also this sort of moral evaluative role. The final component, then, of natural law theory, as Rachel's writing about Aquinas pictures it, is an epistemic component. It's the idea that natural laws are dictates of reason, right? They're things that you can grasp through reason. So here, the natural law theorist is denying that any sort of special religious revelation is needed to know what's morally required of. Having articulated natural law theory in this way, Rachels goes on to criticize it. Well, he has no quarrel with the third component, right? The idea that moral rules are dictates of reason. I mean, actually, you know, he wouldn't put it in quite the same language, but it's a view, that's actually a view he accepts himself. Two of his three criticisms, and the ones we'll turn to first, are directed instead at the other two components, the first and the second component. I think I've got a PowerPoint. Let me look. Yeah, good. Okay. So here's something for you to write down, then we'll talk over these. Begin with the first of these criticisms, which is a criticism of the first component of natural law theory. Rachels develops this criticism, page 56, starting with the second paragraph. He writes, "Third, the theory of natural law is now widely rejected because its view of the world conflicts with modern science. The world, as described by Galileo, Newton and Darwin, has no need for facts about right and wrong. Their explanations of natural phenomena make no reference to values or purposes. What happens just happens, due to the laws of cause and effect. If the rain benefits the plants, this is because the plants have evolved by the laws of natural selection in a rainy climate. Thus, modern science gives us a picture of the world as a realm of facts, where the only natural laws are the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, working blindly and without purpose. Whatever values may be, they are not part of the natural order." This is a plausible line of criticism, right? I mean, the idea here, right, is that the history of science since the time of Aristotle and Aquinas has not been kind to the sort of teleological, purposive approach to scientific explanation that they favored. Right? The kinds of innovations, starting with, you know, the scientific revolution in what the 1500s, 1600s, going through to Darwinian biology and modern science, right? Plausibly, it's viewed as involving systematically the replacement of purposive explanations with non-purposive ones, right? And the initial moves, right, the sort of early scientific revolution stuff, so systematically involves, replacing a picture of the world involving purposive explanation with a sort of atomist picture of the world involving, things as fundamentally little balls of stuff bumping against one another. Right? And of course, that modern science has been enormously more successful in explaining stuff, right, than the scientific theories of the medieval world were. That should not, incidentally, lead you to think that Aristotle or Aquinas were done. I mean, neither of them were at all done, right? I mean, there were atomists in the ancient world, right? But the point was, at that time, there was no evidence showing that atomistic explanations of stuff worked better than the kind of explanation of stuff that Aristotle and Aquinas favored, right? That evidence has only accumulated since the time at which both were writing. But it is nonetheless, from a contemporary perspective, decisive. So that's the first criticism. Criticism of the first component of natural law theory. A second criticism targets the moral role of these specifications of natural law, and in particular the sort of move from the scientific to the moral, right? I mean, you've seen what we have on the PowerPoint here. Look, I mean, as Rachel's developing this criticism pictures it, right? The natural law theorist is the person who thinks that you can straightforwardly deduce moral conclusions from scientific premises, right? You've got these sort of scientific premises about what human nature is like, like people are beneficent, and then you've got this moral, normative, evaluative conclusion, people ought to be beneficent. And the natural law theorist is pictured as thinking you can just deduce the moral or normative thing from the factual thing. Right? If that's what the natural law theorist is doing, then the natural law theorist is certainly making a mistake. Or, well, I'd be a little more hesitant about that. The natural law theorist is making what many philosophers would think of as a mistake. Right? And, the locus classicus for a diagnosis of this mistake is, as Rachel tells us, the work of the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume, right? In a much discussed, much interpreted passage from the start of Book 3 of Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, he complains about the way in which people writing moral philosophy, go on for a while with making factual claims, connected by ises, and then suddenly they start making these normative claims connected by oughts. And he complains that they don't, explain or justify how you're supposed to get from one to the other, right? One standard way of interpreting what Hume is complaining about there is that it is it's a fallacy. It's a you're systematically making invalid arguments if you attempt to go from a is premise to an ought conclusion, right? And as Rachel's here sees it, applying this criticism to natural law theory, that's what the natural law theorist is doing, right? What the natural law theorist is doing is thinking that you can start with these factual premises and directly, immediately, without relying on anything else, whatever, validly get to these evaluative conclusions. And says Rachel's, that's a mistake. All right. So that that basically completes our focus on natural law theory, sort of in its most famous historical guise. But the further thing that's worth doing with more immediate contemporary resonance is thinking a little more about the relationship between moralness and naturalness, independent of natural law theory, as articulated by Aquinas. So why don't I think we'll stop here, but then after our little break, we'll go on with that.